Welcome everybody. Welcome to everyone joining us from around the country and around the world. My name is Jesse Hagopian, and I want to welcome you to our virtual event, Remaking Schools in the Time of Coronavirus. I'm an editor for Rethinking Schools magazine and a co-editor of Teaching for Black Lives, and I edited the book More Than a Score, the new Uprising Against High-Stakes Testing from Haymarket Books. And before we get started, I want to thank the sponsors of this event, Haymarket Books, the New Press, and Rethinking Schools. And I want to urge everyone to visit their websites and buy lots and lots of books and subscriptions to help these important organizations continue their ongoing work. And finally, I want to remind everybody that tomorrow at 12 noon Eastern, there's an unbelievable opportunity to join Arundhati Roy in conversation with Amani Perry here on Haymarket YouTube channel. And there will be also an incredible May Day event with Stacey Davis Gates, Sarah Nelson, and Sarah Jaffe here on May 1st at 5 p.m. Eastern as well. So the links to those conversations will be posted in the chat. So just a little bit of housekeeping first. With so many people joining this call, we just want to ask your patience if we have any technical issues. Hopefully we've straightened those all out, but we're grateful that so many hundreds, actually thousands of people have registered for this live stream. And so it could get choppy at points. And if it does, we ask that you might try reducing your image quality. The video will be recorded and shared afterwards on the Haymarket YouTube channel. And we are reserving time for question and answer at the end. So please post your questions on the live video feed whenever you are watching it. All right. And so I want to get started talking about remaking schools in this moment of crisis. And I'm excited today to be joined in this conversation by fellow educators and authors Wayne Au and Noliwe Rooks. Wayne Au is a professor in the School of Educational Studies at the University of Washington, Bothell. He is a longtime Rethinking Schools editor, co-editor of the book Teaching for Black Lives, and also the author of A Marxist Education, Learning to Change the World. And Noliwe Rooks is the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of Literature at Cornell University and is the author of Cutting School, Privatization, Segregation, and the End of Public Education, which won an award for nonfiction from the Hurston Wright Foundation. And I just want to begin by grounding our conversation in this unprecedented crisis that we find ourselves in today. The mounting COVID-19 crisis is wreaking havoc around the world. As of today, over 2.5 million people have confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the world, although the number is much higher due to lack of testing, and tens of thousands of people have lost their lives around the globe. Maybe over 40,000 here alone in our country. And hospitals around the world have been filled beyond capacity. And in places like New York City, many healthcare workers don't have enough personal protective equipment to guard themselves against the disease. So we face an unprecedented health crisis, but also the economy is in free fall for most people anyway. Right? U.S. unemployment has risen by 22 million people since the pandemic started. And the U.S. now has not seen this level of joblessness since the Great Depression. And, our government has rolled out the CARE Act, which gave $2.2 trillion in stimulus aid to try to address this economic crisis, but predictably workers got the short end of the stick and the corporation got massive windfalls. And then even just today there was a vote in the Senate for a new stimulus bill, and this bill actually provides no stimulus checks for U.S. households, no additional money for food stamps, no limits on fossil fuel bailouts, no funds for election security, no bailouts for the Postal Service, and really no additional funds for the states who are being hard hit with this loss of revenue. And of course, what we've come to talk about here today is the fact that many millions of students are at home due to mass school closures around the world and in our own country, along with millions of their parents who are sheltering in place and who have lost their jobs. And so we find ourselves in an unprecedented crisis here in so many ways, economically and with healthcare. And today we really want to dive into what this crisis means for education in the United States. And I'm really excited to be in this conversation with you both. So welcome to Wayne and to No Leeway. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to the conversation myself.
No doubt.
Happy to be here today and see y'all.
No doubt. Yes, and I hope your families are healthy and well at this time. I know we're all going through a lot of stress, but your families are okay?
Yes.
Yeah, we're doing all right. We're hanging in there. I feel like getting a little bit cabin fever, I guess, but ultimately we're doing fine and can't really complain, I think.
Okay. I think we're all in a similar situation. It's not easy. Even if things are going okay, it's still a challenge in these times. But I thought I'm really looking forward to this discussion with you both. I was just saying that to No Leeway, your book on cutting school is one of my favorites in education. And Wayne, everything you've written has taught me so much. And so this is just an honor to be in conversation with you both. And I want to just begin by talking about what our schools looked like before the crisis, right? People widely understand now that we're in the middle of a COVID crisis, but for many of our students and families, they have been suffering under all kinds of crises for years, right? The crisis of institutional racism and of segregation and poverty and food insecurity and massive wealth inequality. Frankly, they've been suffering under a crisis of capitalism, I think, for a long time. So in Cutting School, No Leeway, you write that about this concept of segronomics, a term you coined to discuss how corporations have long profited off of segregation in education. So you wrote, in almost all major American cities, most Black and Latino students attend public schools where a majority of their classmates qualify as poor or low income. Such neighborhoods and students are the engines of growth for both charter schools and other educational businesses. Segregation pays. So I thought before we go into how COVID impacts education, let's talk about the crisis that many of our students were in before the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for pulling this panel together. And thanks to the folks who are out there. And a special shout out to the parents and caregivers who find themselves as teachers in this period of time. And another shout out for teachers. Hopefully you are feeling much more love as these schools are closed down. Everybody I'm talking to is sending lots and lots of love to you. Yeah, so segronomics, the concept of segronomics really tries to get at the fact that these schools were put together, public schools that are compulsory, are a legacy of the post-Reconstruction period. Some people don't know that. I know that y'all know that, but I want to say it was not always the case that we required, our American citizens required it to go to school. And it was certainly not the case that we said, okay, states and municipalities are going to pay for that to happen. That's a legacy of Reconstruction. It comes out of the Civil War, comes out of trying to figure out how to educate the formerly enslaved. When I started doing the research for this book, I thought I was just going to talk about the 20th century. It was a period where there was a lot of philanthropic support for poor communities, inner city, urban areas, failing schools. Corporate and philanthropic organizations really had stepped up in the 2000s, from the 1990s into the 2000s, and we're saying this is a civil rights crisis, this is a civil rights issue, and we need to fix it. And I wanted to understand that. I wanted to understand where all of that came from, where all of this interest in money and very idiosyncratic forms of education, very different forms of education than were prescribed for wealthy communities. In that period of time, you were seeing no excuses charter schools, on the rise. You were seeing tying test scores to firing teachers, closing schools if their test scores weren't high enough, and replacing them with charter schools. And I was sort of like, okay, this is capitalism at work. I can see that. I can see the billionaires. I can see the corporations. But let me figure out where it came from. And I think the biggest surprise and some of my upset with the book, quite frankly, is why didn't I know that that has always been how public education has functioned for Black kids, brown kids, indigenous kids, and poor children? Why didn't I know that that's how it was designed? I was thinking this was some kind of intervention here in the 20th and 21st century, when in fact it was just a changing same, to paraphrase Amiri Baraka's term. It was just what had always been. These schools were functioning as they were supposed to, as an engine of labor for workers, for large corporations. The kind of education that folks got was far less important in the 19th century, in the 20th century, in the 21st century, than was being able to provide the workers with enough skills to do the low wage jobs that really with the grease that kind of kept the whole thing moving. So Segronomics is just shoving together segregation and economics. The high levels of segregation that we've always seen, the hand-wringing that we in education and outside of education do about segregation and attendant forms of undereducation. What I started to ask at the end of writing this book is, but if there's so much money to be made by undereducating kids in segregated communities for these corporations, honestly, what is the motivation for them to end segregation? Is it hard for us to break it up? Is it hard for us, brown v. board or no, to actually educate kids the same, in the same ways, because there's simply too much money to be made by undereducating certain kids. And you need that hyper segregation in order to make it.
Thank you for breaking that down, for sure. Wayne, you've done also a lot of research and writing about the inequality that's built into the school system.
Yeah. I mean, I think, as we look at the crisis, preceding the crisis, right? And there's so much, I resonate so much with of what Noliwe said around, like, you really have to ask these questions about, where's the, not just the motivations, but, sort of where's the payoff for treating these communities wholesale in these kinds of ways, right? And so we could, you could see it, but fundamentally the crisis of education pre-coronavirus, pre-COVID-19 was really, the crisis of a capitalist education that really is built on systems that are really meant to produce and maintain inequalities, whether, whatever, we'll talk about testing a little bit later, but, whether it's test scores or graduation rates or access to resources in schools, all that kind of stuff, school funding, and then the things outside of school that we know impact how students engage with schools, whether it's affordable housing, access to healthcare, affordable dental care, livable wages, like all these things, food insecurity, that the crises that exist for schools pre-COVID are in many ways the ones that we're seeing now, just being exacerbated by the response to the coronavirus. It was a crisis of massive inequality and a massive differential of resources, and people working within a system where they, the value for them is taking care of themselves on their own, and having affluent parents, protecting their PTA money, and tax systems that benefit the wealthy, that don't benefit the masses of people, right? I mean, these are the things that produce the educational inequalities that we saw beforehand, and these are the same things that are essentially, being again exacerbated by what's happening in the now.
And maybe just a quick follow-up question on that, Wayne, because you talked about how the education system reflects the crises of capitalism, but maybe you could just talk about how the public school system was formed in the first place, the conflicting desires between like big business and also communities that wanted public education.
Yeah. I mean, that's been part of the history of public education in this country. Is always just a site of contradiction, where you have usually the large and powerful, and the corporations, and a lot of the folks that know the way raised, seeing the public school system as in some ways a mechanism for producing workers, in some spaces in ways a mechanism for actually generating profit, like we're seeing more of now, and also a way to sort of do other kinds of social and even cultural forms of control, right? Particularly for, partly for non-white communities in terms of Americanization and sort of the racial politics around that, but then also just using schools historically as a way to build nationalism and support capitalism as a whole in terms of the production of ideology in this country. And so you see schools playing that kind of role on the one hand. On the other hand, all of our communities have always used education and made use of schools in ways that would contradict those larger forces too, right? As schools as sites of resistance and places to develop critical consciousness. And so, for communities of color in particular, historically in this country, as the public school system was being formed, for some of those communities, they were like, we don't want any part of this because we're going to do our own schooling and take care of our own. And part of that was a cultural decision too, right? We didn't necessarily want to have, our kids in schools that were being run by white folks with a predominantly Eurocentric curriculum and that kind of stuff, right? And part of it was then being segregated by the racism by the larger school system too. But yeah, so we've always sort of had this space of like this larger force pushing education and folks using education to try and sort of maintain a sort of status quo inequalities from the beginning, but at the same time, communities of color, working class communities, also making use of schools in ways that are resistant, and that can be counter to the inequalities.
No doubt. I'm teaching this year language arts and ethnic studies framework, and here in Seattle in high school. And just to add about the crises before COVID, I mean, we have 150 homeless students at the high school where I teach at, right? There are 40,000 homeless kids across Washington state alone. Studies have shown that like half of students in America are below the poverty line. I mean, the crises for our students are so real. And, we've had to build a Black Lives Matter at School movement to push back against the institutional racism that is in your face for our Black kids every day. I mean, the level of hate crimes have doubled in Seattle and have skyrocketed around the country, and they have gone right into the school buildings, right? You have, police officers jacking kids up against the wall, viral videos from Chicago and other places of them knocking kids down. Our school systems are we have 1.6 million kids in this country that go to a school with no counselor but has a police officer, right? So the kind of way that we just perpetuate trauma in our schools is really breathtaking before the crisis. But I want us to get into now how you think the crisis is going to impact this already inequitable system. I think many people whose privileges allowed them not to see what was going on just didn't understand that schools provided much more than instruction for many kids, that they provided vital services such as disability support services, healthcare, lunch and breakfast, and a lot more. So at the same time, we know most of our schools are not community schools that really provide all the wraparound services students need. We also know that they have played vital roles in many of our kids and families' life. So what do you think the impact of, the COVID crisis is on the most vulnerable students? And let's talk about that.
Yeah, I think, as you were saying, one of the education is one of the things that happens in school buildings. One of the things that is being missed, I think, for kids across the spectrum, is a sense of community, a different kind of sense of community, where you go and you have your different cliques and different classrooms and people you sit with and jokes that you share, and relationships that you're really able to cultivate, and identities that are sort of yours. And to have that taken from you wholesale. And even I teach college students, and my college students all went home as well. And I'm talking to them about the stresses and strains of being in a home where, or for some being in a shelter. Some left Cornell and ended up in their families, with their families in transitional housing, or dealing with ICE issues. The coronavirus has not stopped, or for a while, or there at the beginning, did not stop ICE from separating families. And those were the families that Cornell was sending kids back into. Not all of the Cornell kids, before that population. And I think about that. These are adults. They're 18, 19, 20 years old. And they're adults that have had the benefit of an institution that is focused, laser-like, on their well-being and betterment. In privileged spaces like that, that's one of the things that kids can expect. Mm-hmm. To think about kids who don't have that, who are in much rockier kinds of circumstances, who are then told, go find some internet. Everything's internet. You got to go online in order to do this. What we know is some communities use the phone as their primary source of internet access. They do not have broadband. That's part of what the tech inequality looks like. But they're told to then go to a public library, go to, there's an image that was coming across my social media feed not long ago of a young man sitting in front of McDonald's, I think, sitting on the sidewalk in front of McDonald's, doing his homework because he didn't have internet access. Those kinds of inequalities, I think, have an impact both on the ability of the students to think of themselves as students, to think of themselves as valued, to maintain a center, a kind of center and a core. It also makes it difficult for them just to keep up with whatever schoolwork they're supposed to be doing. So in terms of social, community, technological, this is devastating, unavoidable, right? Like, we understand that there's a pandemic. Well, some of us understand. There's some leaders who apparently do not fully grasp that there's a pandemic, and so heroic actions have to be taken to keep people safe. But the fact that we are in a country that where students, communities, and parents are far more prepared for a crazy person to come into their building and shoot them than they are for the disruption of education. The fact that emergency planning, ideas of what do we do in a crisis if education is impacted, is not on anybody's table. It's not anything that anyone is preparing teachers or students or communities for. Tells you something about the lack of understanding of what those schools represent, what our schools represent, and a lack of value, a lack of ability to completely value those babies. If they're 20, I still call them babies, I'm old. Those babies who go there and it's their lifeline. It's a certain kind of lifeline. If you take that, what I don't know that we fully know what that kind of impact will be. We'll be able to trace what they did and didn't learn during the break. We'll be able to trace if they lost math, if they lost language. We'll be able to trace that, and we will. With certain kids, we will. I think the rest, it remains unknown. The full impact.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess if I were just to add, I mean, I also think a lot about the, what does it mean to try and teach and learn now in the midst of this? Like we know domestic violence, cases are up by some astronomical percent because of the quarantine and the shelter-in-place orders, and we know, like we're not in irregular conditions, and so my worry about the impacts of the crisis in the now is sort of like what harms are being visited upon kids, for a wide range of reasons, who are mental health stuff, whatever, just trying to like cope and deal with the situation and the conditions that they're in, and we're expecting them to learn. Right, and we're expecting them to get to the McDonald's parking lot to get some access to Wi-Fi, right? To do this, to me, it's ridiculous to be seeing it that way. And so I worry, I think there's things around the academic and the sort of scholarly subjects that folks are worried about, and that raises sort of larger questions around sort of what is the purpose of school and what should we be learning or not. But I more worry about the long-term effects of sort of the psychological impact that I think this whole moment is having on kids, especially kids who are broke and just having to make it through whatever to survive the moment. I mean, that's not an easy task. And when we don't have, what little social supports we have in the United States, and compared to other countries, it is very, very little. When we lose one of those main ones in public schools, one of those spaces that can be a support for folks, for kids, then it's a major, like losing community is major, and it impacts us in such huge ways. And so I am just currently like really, really worried about how our students come out of this, even from a mental health perspective. Like we can learn stuff later if need be, but it's more about how do you come out as a person and feeling about yourself in the world, and is to me is the big thing that I worry about in terms of one of the big extensions of this.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I mean, I'm worrying about the well-being of my students in my classes, their social and emotional well-being, their psychological well-being, much more than I'm worried about what they might have missed from my class academically. And, when we talk about those 150 homeless kids at my high school, it wasn't just meals that they got from Garfield, right? I mean, they've set up some sites around Seattle where you can go and get meals, which, can be a challenge for some families to get to those sites, first of all. But so there is some food that's still being provided, thankfully, for families that need it. But those homeless students relied on our school to do their laundry, right? Mm-hmm. They relied on our school to take showers. The trauma counseling that helps them get through the day. And so their basic well-being, I feel like, is where we need to be flooding resources. And it's just an obscenity to me that we can live in a city with the tech giants that we have, I mean, the richest corporations the world has ever known, Boeing, Microsoft, Starbucks, Amazon, go down the list, and yet we have so many homeless kids, right? And yet we have a huge digital divide in our city. You know, they said that a third of students already have not logged on to the school websites, and we also have that coincides with the fact that a third of students in the Seattle schools live in poverty, right? So yeah, I'm worried about their social and emotional well-being right now, and trying to check in with them. But you know, for those who don't have internet access, it's hard to maintain that connection with them. And I want to ask you all a question about this idea of what they're going to be losing academically as well. You know, the New York Times editorial board wrote a piece about learning loss, and they quoted researchers who said some students could lose an entire academic year of learning, and it would also, they said, quote, a learning reversal of this magnitude could hobble an entire generation unless state leaders quickly work to reverse the slide. So I just think a lot of people are thinking about what's going to be lost academically as well. And how do we think about that?
Here, Wayne, you want to go first this time? I feel like we've developed a round robin thing.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I'll go. I'll keep it briefly. I'm trying to keep. We have about 30 minutes left to our conversation. I want to make sure we get to some of the other stuff we want to talk about. But yeah, you know, for me, I like, again, the whole thing raises big questions for me, big philosophical questions about what's the purpose of schooling, what should we be learning, not learning, what's important to learn. And so, you know, I understand folks who are like, oh, my kid's going to fall behind in whatever math or writing or whatever. And part of me is sympathetic to that. Part of me also isn't, in the sense that, like, look, you know, we were already dealing with a system that was focusing almost solely on like tested subjects, right? And so it was this hyper focus on a particular kind of academics that I don't think was particularly healthy for our students. And that's not that I'm opposed to folks learning how to do math or to read critically or to write. So no one get that twisted. But it's more about, like, what is this whole focus on these very rigid notions of curriculum and things that are focused mainly on passing the tests. What does that do to the quality of education overall? And so in some ways, part of me is also like, well, you know, I get that people are worried about losing time and from an academic point of view. But on the other hand, I'm like, we're also getting a moment here to sort of like rethink all of that stuff. Like, what is it, like, what is important about learning this or learning this, versus like what I'm able to actually engage my kid with at home, right? In this space of you know, I've got lots of friends who are like, hey, I finally get to teach my kids social studies, and they're going to get recess and lunchtime, right? Because they're at home and we're working through this stuff. So yes, there'll be some things sort of lost if your framework is purely this academic, like, test score thing. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot of opportunity for things to be gained, even from, you know, cultural knowledge and cultural practices, and people have their kids gardening and they're in the earth and making connections to the environment. I mean, like, there's all this other stuff going on, and so you know, some things might be lost, but there's also going to be some things gained. And again, it's really about what do we feel like is important for you know, for us as communities and as people to learn about and sort of be with in terms of knowledge in this world.
Yeah, I mean, I have a knee-jerk, literal, almost hit in the gut reaction to hearing a generation of what in my mind I went to Black people and brown people be hobbled. That's a terminology that leaves a vision, and that language is power. And I'd rather not refer to people, you know, as being hobbled. It's also ableist, you know, but. But I do think I think the larger thing for me is that these schools were shut down one after another, school district after school district, without as far as I know, for the districts I'm familiar with, actually asking people in some communities that were going to be hardest hit, how can we do this well? What does it look like? We're going to have to take these schools offline. We're going to have to go to online learning. We're going to have to go to some other kind of way of doing this. Tell us what we need to know to do it well. Join us at this table as we're about to dismantle this. And tell us for your kids, the kids in your neighborhoods, who do we need to have at this table? What do we need to put in place? What is most urgent? For me, that's a continuing issue when talking about public education and certain kids. Who do you ask for the help? There are all manner of folks in all of those communities. There are no poor communities, no struggling communities, no black communities, no brown communities. Don't have a plethora of educators, of knowledge, of thought, of activists who are willing to go the extra mile and do what needs to be done to make sure those kids get educated. But we never get asked, right? And so someone else created a problem on top of a problem. And it's going to be up to us to solve it, or our kids are going to suffer. Some of what Wayne was saying is absolutely, I think is the reasons that we're seeing this big jump in homeschooling amongst certain communities. You have indigenous folks, black folks, some Latinx folks who are like, let me have my kid. Let me teach them. Let me teach them social studies. Let me teach them science by going out and gardening. Let me teach them, let me do it. Because what I see happening in the taxpayer-supported public schools are not my values, are not in the best interest of my kid. And then people keep saying my kid's undereducated on top of that. Like, you're not even in line with what I want for them as being a human being. And then you're going to tell me something wrong with them or that they can't learn, right? Give them back, right? We're seeing that's the largest kind of spike that we're seeing for all of those reasons. But what we know, what I am going to guarantee you, for the kids who are left behind, who are trying to navigate this the best way they know how, they're going to come out labeled. They're going to come out a problem, being referred to as a problem. Cornel West talks about the difference between being a problem people and a people with problems. And that is always stuck in my head because you can almost predict the moments where problems not of their making are going to be used to start to describe entire communities as a problem. It costs us too much to educate you now because during the time of Corona, you lost too much time. It's going to cost us too much to find some more teachers. In New York City, I saw like 50 teachers had died from Corona. We now have to replace you. But it's only, so certain teachers in certain communities seem to be harder hit, as is true with so much. So these problems that are not of the making of these communities, what's going to happen is they're going to be labeled as a problem that is hard for us all to solve. And now we need you to roll up your sleeves, bootstrap, stop listening to rap music and playing games and teach your kids. And without actually acknowledging that, it's our kids that this system is committed to not teaching. That's right. To not. The system is not. So the system is going to have to change on the other side of this. And at some point, we're going to have to talk about the ways that communities have always known how to educate kids. These kids is not rocket science. It's not like nobody's ever done it. We not do it. And people know how it's being done wrong. But what that looks like to have that knowledge be central in a publicly funded space, in a publicly funded institution, is the battle to me and is the conversation that we're going to have at some point.
Yeah.
We're gonna flip it a little bit because I was gonna ask Jesse a question. He's been writing on his blog about parenting at home. That sort of picks up on the idea of folks doing the homeschooling piece too, right? And so basically, and this is language I've seen you use elsewhere, Jesse. You've been talking about how parents are being literally conscripted into being teachers for their kids at home, right? Like suddenly we have all these really professional teachers, right? Folks, it's their job, and they got advanced degrees, become teachers, and work with kids in schools. And then suddenly, like, okay, everyone's at home. All right, parents, all y'all teach everybody, and like it's going to be like, and pretend that that's going to be like okay and easy. And there's been a lot of advice, lots of conversation about how how we should go about this. How do we go about teaching our kids at home? But I feel like a lot of the advice really misses how that for a lot of the most vulnerable communities, working class communities of color in particular, folks who are having to basically still maintain work as out of what considered quote unquote essential jobs. They don't really have time to be teachers at the same time, and I would say it's even true not just for working class communities, but even for myself as like a university administrator. I don't have time to do my job and teach my son, right? But I think it falls hardest on working class folks for sure. And so what do you think? What's your vision of sort of learning at home for the rest of the school year in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a real challenge for me too, to continue teaching my courses and to try to teach my 7-year-old and 11-year-old at home. I think the first thing that needs to be said is we need to eliminate all high stakes to education completely for the rest of the year everywhere. And that means grades as well as high stakes testing. The idea that we're going to be grading kids or punishing kids with lower grades is just outrageous to me. When you think about the disparities that exist in this country, when you think about some of our kids don't have a place to sleep at night, and we're going to be judging whether they're able to do online learning. I mean, there's just no equitable way to do it, and any kind of grading will just further exacerbate the inequalities that were already there. And so we got to eliminate that altogether. And then parents are in a tough spot of just having to try to do whatever they can, right, to support their kids. And I have no judgment for parents who are not in a place to be able to provide, an education going through all the subjects of the day. I think if your kid is able to regulate themselves and have come at the end of the day, you all are still talking to each other after being quarantined for weeks at a time, you're learning a lot about social and emotional development there. And so, parents whose main subject is film studies during the day, I can't really judge that right now. Whatever we have to do to get through the day and to let our kids know we love them and we'll support them, that's what I think we need to do. At the same time, I've found great joy in being able to engage my kids in different subjects that are important to me. And I think as parents are able to, there can be a lot of great positive mental health for both your kids and you, engaging them in subjects that are important to you. So, my 11-year-old son, I think the greatest academic outcome for him during quarantine has been him putting together a hip hop song with his friend, and they would get on FaceTime and share the lyrics and then record them and send them to each other and add it to the beat they made. And they came up with this track called Quarantined.
Wow.
Yeah. And they talk about social isolation and how to stay connected to each other while they're apart. And they talk about racism against Chinese Americans and they brought in writing and reading and social studies and music and art. And that's something they never would have had a chance to do, right? And so I think there's ways that we can emphasize other things that they wouldn't necessarily get when we have the opportunity to. But I think that the direction that education is going in, though, is very scary right now. And I want to move into discussing some very real challenges that we're facing for the remaking of public schools right now, because I think we're experiencing what really a textbook example of what Naomi Klein has called the Shock Doctrine, where billionaires exploit moments of crisis to further line their pockets. And they are just feasting off this COVID crisis. We saw how disaster capitalism worked during Hurricane Katrina, right? The charter industry came in after the disaster in New Orleans and replaced all the public schools with a privatized system. It's basically 100% charter school, no public schools left in New Orleans. So how do you all think the Shock Doctrine is at play right now in this education crisis?
Well, I'm a little bit grateful that this did not happen about 10 years ago, when it seemed to me the privatization movement was riding a little higher than maybe it is now. Now we do have presidential candidates saying, or Joe Biden has said very clearly, I think we need to be putting more money into traditional public schools, and not necessarily talking about the charter schools as much, or privatization as much, or vouchers as much. About 10 years ago, that was not the narrative. And so this happening then, I think we would have an organized movement for privatizing everything. Like, why open your school back up? Let's just continue with the failed online learning. Online learning, it's not, online learning works well for well-prepared students. If students have a really solid basis in grammar, math, blah, 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 and they're at the upper levels of whatever charts that you have. They have curiosity and whatever. They can manage to online learn for some time and not lose ground, right? They're going to come out of it and still be in the same classes. They're not going to be in remedial anything. They're not going to be. For kids who actually need some help with what style of learning do you have, for example? Kids in poor communities, you don't always know. Are they visual learners? Do they more learn by doing? Do you need to explain it more times? Do they need to see it? In wealthier school districts, teachers spend time figuring out how individual kids learn best. You don't get that with online learning. And I think in earlier periods, a little earlier, we were so enamored with the idea that teachers were evil, and that schools were unnecessary, and we should just let everybody go and teach themselves, that this would have been much scarier than it is now. I think people, there will be a move. I think what's coming, what we know from what we can see, is all of the shortfalls that we're having at state and local levels. The first pot that the money is being withdrawn from is the educational pot. In these early days, as people talk about what are we going to do for these budget shortfalls, we're seeing education budgets being slashed. I think in New York City, it's almost 50%. They're expecting about 50% less for public schools. And I'm hearing that story all over the country. How do you remake? You can't, so given that, if you're getting half your budget out, you can't do what you did before the crisis. You just can't. But we do need to start having conversations now, because we know that. Like, we know you take half the money, it's not going to look the same. But who's going to get shortchanged more than anybody else? We know that too, I feel like. So we need to start having those conversations right now. If you're going to consolidate schools, if you're going to start moving teachers around, if you're going to start coming up with like cute experimental teaching techniques, we need to have folks from those communities at the table talking about what will and will not work up front, and not have the billionaires come rush in with a checkbook and say, hey, I've got another experiment I want to try. I don't know if it's going to work, but it sure sounds good when me and my friends sit around and talk about it. So let me try it on your communities. I think we do ourselves a disservice if we believe that we go back to what was coming out of this, that we go back to those same buildings, those same teachers, you don't get half your budget cut and have that happen. So those are real conversations that I think that we need to have. And I don't think it's a one size fits all, as I don't for education in general. And so I would urge anyone listening who are members of communities, if you're union members, teachers, activists, and you care about this issue, now is the time to start pulling yourselves together and figure out what would work best. What is the least we can accept? What will we lay our bodies in front of to keep from happening? Because if you wait for this to be over and for people to say, well, now we just have no choice, we know the kids who will get the short end of that.
Yeah, and the only way I think the first part of your question was, I mean, your point was, I mean, it was a great answer, but it struck me, I hadn't thought about that. I think that the fact that this isn't 10 years ago actually is really helpful, and that was great. That hadn't occurred to me, because it's true. Like we see them chomping at the bit right now. Like they're literally salivating, right? We know, here's DeVos out there like trying to figure out more ways to use this crisis to get vouchers and use the federal bailout money for charters and other sort of free market reforms. We got all these Koch brothers funded centers now saying, yes, online learning, this is it. We all need to be going in. Like they do see that opportunity, and they are working in those directions. And it's a chance for them to undermine the teachers unions too, right? Because we have everyone dispersed and not collected in their buildings, and they like to use financial crises to go after collective bargaining. I mean, there's all these ways, marketing, private online, learning opportunities, and all that. Like and so we can see them salivating. They want to come for it, but I think the back end of that that you raise as well is so critical. Is sort of like what do we go back to after this? I mean, I feel like this whole thing is laid bare. A whole lot of this stuff. Like we don't need the testing. We can choose to dish that if we want. We can actually sit here and focus on what we feel like is super powerful and needed for education. Like it's I think people shoot. If there's an argument about the need to learn science right now, like that's critical, and folks' scientific literacy, needs to be built up. Stuff around, stuff you raised before, Jesse, when you were speaking before, and on your blog, you've talked a lot about, the kinds of, the social, racial, class inequalities that are happening. Like all this stuff, just this whole crisis sort of laid bare about what are we going back to? Are we going to have large classes? Are we going to have, we're like there's just so much that we can just sort of begin to think about and dream about, okay, what would it mean to go back to? The biggest thing for me was just looking at this going, oh, okay, they just canceled testing. Yeah. Hey, we can do that. Right? Like we decide to do it, we can do it. You know what I'm saying? And so I don't know, there's so many other avenues for that kind of thinking, and we're doing art and we're doing PE. I mean, we're doing the things that we want, that we think are important. And so I just think all of that has been laid bare by this whole thing about what are we going to go back to? What kind of schooling, what kind of education system are we thinking about returning to, assuming we do get to return at some point here. At some point.
Yeah. And I want to get into that for our last question, to talk about what our vision for what public schools could be, and how we'd want to reopen them in a new way that would be anti-shock doctrine. I just want to throw my 2 cents in about this conversation too, because Noliwe, I think you raised a really good point about had this happened a decade ago when they were just gaining steam for all their corporate education reforms, we would have been in real trouble. And when the last crisis of the Great Recession hit, that's exactly what they did. They used the Great Recession to push race to the top, which was, the carrot that they used to force states into more high-stakes testing that we know is part of the school-to-prison pipeline, and to increase caps on charter schools around the country, right? So they used that crisis to push a shock doctrine kind of approach to education that help further privatize and enrich the wealthy, right? And over the last 10 years, we've built a massive resistance to that shock doctrine, right? And we've actually had incredible victories. So the Red State Revolt of educators shutting down entire states, right? and saying we'll reopen the schools when you get ready to fund them, right? And right, uncovering how teachers are working 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet, and the deplorable conditions in school buildings, especially in these segregated schools where they're falling apart. And then, you know, the strikes in Chicago and in LA where they went on strike, not just for their own wages, which they deserve, but also to dramatically reduce high-stakes standardized testing. In LA, one of their demands was to stop random searches of students by police, right? And they ended up winning that in every school building. They won a $1 million fund to support undocumented immigrant students in their legal fees, right? And so they built this kind of social justice, social movement, unionism approach to fight back against some of the worst of the corporate ed reform movement. And because of that, we're in a lot better position right now to take on their new shock doctrine that's really pushing, right, the online learning, the quote personalized learning that will further enrich corporations and denies the fact that the real education happens through collaboration, not just through, right, doing worksheets or clicking on the right answer on a screen, but by problem solving, by identifying problems in our world, and by figuring out collective solutions to those problems. And that's when I've seen learning come to life in my classroom. And that can't be replicated through a tech company course, right? And so, you know, I worry that now their main strategy is going to be to try to use this crisis to push a whole set of ideological victories for the wealthiest. Because right now, millions of people rejected the idea that there wasn't enough. We live in the world's richest country, and millions of people are demanding Medicare for all, that everyone should have health care. Millions of people are demanding that we raise the minimum wage around the country, right? And we had some pretty serious demands that were embodied in demands that Bernie Sanders was raising in his campaign, and that grassroots activists and movements were demanding. And now I think this crisis is going to mean that they are going to push the idea that there isn't enough, right? That there's no longer enough to help your child, to help your family, and we're all just going to have to tighten our belts and make do with less. Meanwhile, they're going to take all the bailout money and it further enrich the corporations, right? And so I think that's our big task right now, is to make sure that we push back on that. And finally, I want us to just take a last minutes here talking about our vision for what the schools could be when we reopen them. What do y'all think?
I hope that as these community schools reopen, that they're able to push to hold on to the best of what they were, right? And that what they're able to leave behind are the things that they could stand to leave behind. So all of the ways that kids going into a classroom walk in feeling valued, just walking in the door feeling valued before anybody tells them what they need to learn or what they need to read. The ways that some classrooms that we've all had the experience, we walk into and it's a hug. It's a hug for them. It's an emotional and social hug. I want that back. I want to make sure that we don't lose that. The rest of it we can put together. That you don't rebuild people very easily. You can rebuild a classroom. You can rebuild a curriculum. It's far more difficult to rebuild a person. And so I hope the children that we get back, that there's enough left of them, enough innocence, faith, trust in these institutions, in these communities, and in us to give us another chance.
For me to answer that, well, there's a couple of things I think about. One has not to do so much with the schools themselves, but more about I hope there's been a spread of sort of mass consciousness about the importance of public schools and the importance of teachers in the midst of all this, as folks have come to realize the really crucial role that the schools as an institution play in our communities, like these really critical roles. And so, again, 10 years ago, when the language is about how it was all bad teachers and all getting rid of public schools, I'd like to see them try and push that now. I don't think folks are going to be on board with that. So that's one piece of learning. I hope that sort of the broader we get from this. But for me, what I hope going back into schools is that the experience has actually got us to a place to really, again, question what is important, again, what's worth keeping, like you said, in a way, like it's because the crisis around the COVID-19 sort of crisis, yes, it does create opportunities for Koch brothers and all those folks to try and do what they want to do. On the other hand, that crisis also presents us, with folks on the ground, with sort of a different kind of opportunity, right? Because there's been this disruption, and maybe we've begun to question, do we need the testing? Do we need to be teaching X? Do we need to be teaching Y? Oh, then, what ethnic studies is really important to me. Like, it creates an opening for us to kind of rethink what we're doing. And I hope we can fill that space around, that space of rethinking what we're doing in terms of education with the stuff that we know is good. And so I'm hoping, for me, that as we move back into the schools at some point, that again, in the spirit of sort of keeping what's good, also maybe feeling freer from this experience to go ahead and bring in something new, or something you were scared to do before that is good, and also get rid of something that you might have been scared to get rid of from before as well, right? Like the rupture also creates this opportunity for us to rethink ourselves as educators and schools, and as rethink what the purpose of schools. And so I hope we can use that space in ways that's that's healing, and that's liberatory, and that's resistant. And so I want folks to be sort of freed from the constraints they felt before, and go, oh, okay, I can do what I need to do, so yeah.
Oh, we can't hear you. Are you muted?
Yes. All right.
Okay.
Thank you. So let me just say a couple words on this, and then we have some questions coming in from some of the people watching on live stream, and we'll take questions in a moment. But I just want to say on this that their vision for the schools after COVID-19 is replacing teachers with computers and doing more online and quote personalized learning, right, as a way to enrich tech companies. And we could put forward a much more compelling vision of what is potentially possible with public education. And we can point to the community schools model. And I think we can say now more than ever, schools should be hubs of support for our families, right? They could provide wraparound services. They could provide health care. And I think the demand for a nurse in every school would make so much sense to every single working person in America, that we need to go on the offensive with a national campaign immediately to make sure schools reopen with at least one full-time nurse in every school building, right? And I think that has the potential to gain traction, but it will be up to whether we can build a movement big enough to do that. But school psychologists and trauma counselors and restorative justice counselors and social workers that can help families dealing with homelessness and food insecurity. I think this crisis has revealed to many millions of people just how unstable so many families are. And I think our school system could be remade to support our communities and could connect with more and more people. So that's my hope for how we move forward. And I want to ask you guys a couple questions that have come in from listeners to our discussion. So there's several questions about what we can do now, what organizing efforts we can be involved in the fight for more equitable schools. Anyone want to take that up?
There are all manner of groups depending on where you are. Some are national. One group that for white listeners, I tend to focus on communities of color, but one that's specifically trying to organize white parents around noticing inequality and making choices with their kids to help to integrate schools. I have a complex relationship with the idea of integration. However, it's the thing that we know that works systemically. It does other things, but it systemically works. So that's called Integrated Schools. They're a national organization. And again, for white parents who are really like, I want to get in there and make sure that I can use this privilege, the ways that whiteness functions as capital and access. And I want to make sure that I'm using that to keep public schools strong. That's one group that's doing that. But your group, the Rethinking Schools, right? You know, that's an organizing entity. That's a group where you can get together with like-minded folks and come up with strategies that you can start to operationalize what we're saying and what we're thinking. I don't think that there's a shortage of people or organizations that are addressing these issues, but I would urge people to investigate who in your community is doing this work. I can guarantee you they're there, but we don't always know who they are. So.
Yeah. There's a lot, and I think to me it's just that investigative piece, because so much of it is localized too. I mean, Rethinking Schools is a place where a lot of these folks convene in a way, right, through the publications or the magazine or the website. But there's also we have regional conferences. There's the Northwest Teaching for Social Justice Conference. There's San Francisco Teaching for Social Justice. There's the Chicago Social Justice Curriculum Fair. There's a whole bunch more. I mean, there's all these ones that are around. And so I think the main thing for folks is, if you want to get active, is to really search out those things regionally and locally that you can attend and go find your people. That's what I'm always telling the teachers that I work with, right? I'm like, go find your people, because that's where you get access to who's doing the organizing, who's doing the work, and then you can start sorting through who you want to be with. My only caveat to say around that is that you do have to do your homework within that space, right? There's a whole sort of nonprofit industrial complex that exists around education and education reform, and there's a lot of folks who use language of justice and equity in their framing as nonprofits, but a fair number of those are backed by billionaire hedge funds, or like they're part of the corporate ed machine, and so you just have to sort of sort through and really pick through. Also, one of my favorite groups is Education for Liberation, which is a national organization that's led by folks of color and does a lot of really radical work too. So I always make sure to give them a shout out too.
Yeah, and I'd just add that I think folks should get involved with the Black Lives Matter at School movement.
Yeah. You
can go to blacklivesmatteratschool.com. And we have 4 demands in this movement. The first is to end zero tolerance discipline and replace it with restorative justice. Mm-hmm. We talk about hiring more Black educators. Third, we're saying we need to have Black studies and ethnic studies in all of our schools. And then lastly, we say fund counselors, not cops, so we can help heal the trauma and stop the school to prison pipeline. And, for the first week in February every year for the last few years, we have a week of action in the schools. And this is an opportunity to get together with parents, students, educators, and plan what you're going to do for the week of action to help really raise the severity of institutional racism in our schools and kick off a conversation that hopefully will go all throughout the school year. And every day of the week, we teach to one of the 13 principles of the Black Lives Matter Global Network in our classrooms. And thousands of teachers across the country have participated in it in over 40 cities last year. And we hope to build the movement even bigger this year. And, I'm also co-editing a book to help explain the rise of that movement and the potential of that to come out for next year. So
also, Jesse, to add to say that, if folks who are involved in their unions, in their education unions, don't forget about the union organizing too, obviously, right? So there's often progressive caucuses of the unions doing really good organizing and trying to move the union work much more progressively and much more leftward than a lot of the unions are. So that would be another space too for organizers.
Well, absolutely. That was like one of the questions that just came in, actually, was about, what's the role of teachers unions in this movement right now? And I know Wayne and I, we've both endorsed a caucus that's running in the local teachers union elections here. It's called the School Seattle Deserves, and they have a social justice and ethnic studies platform, racial justice platform, and that election will be done around on April 30th. We'll find out. We'll find out who wins, and we're hoping that our School Seattle Deserves caucus helps to transform our union to look much more like LA and Chicago, because I've been so inspired by their fights against privatization in those cities. Have you followed those fights at all?
I have. They're amazing. Yes. Chicago in particular, has a long history of union organizing. And very often, though, the more active unions, what you're saying is it's a city that's organized. Teachers, people who are active in organizing, it's usually not just for schools. They're organizing around politics, police brutality, food access, environmental justice. Some happen to be teachers. Some happen to be teachers who are members of unions. Some happen to be teachers who are members of unions whose leadership they're fighting against tooth and nail. Because there's the national leadership and there's the local leadership and then there's the rank and file. And so it gets hard some places to cast a broad net about unions as one thing or another. Chicago is not hard. It's not hard at all. They are on the side of a good fight. They are and a fight that's about the whole child and the whole community, and what will benefit it all. They're not just about what is happening in the classrooms. And so if you're looking for unions, I mean, also for teachers unions, just investigate the politics of the people who are running it, because I often run into folks who are like, but the folks in my teachers union are not for the things that I'm for, and that can happen. But when you get a place like, Chicago, or you get LA or other smaller places all over the country where people are about it, they're about social change, they're about social justice, and they see the schools as a part of a larger conversation. Yeah, that you want to support every way you can. Even if you're not a teacher, there's all kinds of ways to support unions and union organizing that's separate from membership.
Yeah, and I think it's critical is that in terms of the question, then those kinds of unions, they can be the defender of against the privatization efforts, and also they can be the stewards for the more radical and more equitable and more visionary forms of education if they so choose to be, right? And so in this moment, I think that's the role of unions, is to be fighting on the side of equity and justice, and be a bulwark, against, be a bulwark against the sort of corporate reforms that are being pushed from the other side as we start thinking about moving back towards school.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in Chicago, they have actually fought and won community schools and a commitment to funding of wraparound services at a growing number of community schools there. And I would encourage people, educators who are on this call, to look for a social justice caucus in their unions and join it if they have one. And if they don't have one, start your own, right? So the Working Educators Caucus in Philadelphia is the reason why we have a national Black Lives Matter at School movement, right? I mean, we had a first action here in Seattle, but they took it and expanded it to a week of action in Philly, and then helped to make it a national movement. right? And the core caucus that won in Chicago helped to transform that union. And the More caucus in New York is doing incredible work pushing forward a pro student and teacher agenda during this COVID crisis. And so, definitely join the Social Justice Caucus or support it if you're a parent, for sure. So I just really have enjoyed my time with you all in this conversation. And I hope that everybody listening has learned so much. I thought I'd just ask lastly how people can stay in touch with you all or follow your work.
Well, so I have a website, noliwerooks.com. I'm at Cornell with the email nrooks@Cornell. And then I'm on Twitter, and my handle is nrookie. Yeah, NROOKIE.
Thanks. Wayne?
Yeah, I'm a social media Luddite for the most part, so I have no Insta or no Twitter or anything. But you can get me on Facebook if you want. My email is widely available at the University of Washington or through Rethinking Schools, so folks can get at me if they need to, and I'm happy to always support and make myself available as much as I can, at least as folks need. So.
Right on. And people can find me on my website, IamAnEducator.com, or on Twitter, Jesse D. Hagopian. I would love to hear from folks how you're building the struggle in your areas, and what we can do to link together a national movement for a new vision of what public education could be. So thank you all so much for this time together. I learned a lot from you both and look forward to working with you.
All right.
Likewise.
Stay healthy, y'all. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. Take care. Have a good one.
Jeff.